Welcome to Legacy Conversations, a channel where we preserve military memories and history.
Hello, Internet. Good golly gosh. A long time since I've had a word with one of our guests, but it's always a pleasure. Today, I'm going to be chatting with a lad that joined up national service. Interesting history. I think his parents, or he even, could have been born in Scotland, but his parents definitely hailed from Scotland. So I'm going to let him tell you it all. All I'll say to you is that he was drafted to go to SAI, where he did the driving course, and from there on, he did more things in his 2 years national service than lots of other people would have dreamed to have done. He was in places where, for instance, I'm going to give you one, 3-1 Battalion, Omega. I only ever flew over there on 2 occasions. Never had the privilege of landing there, if I can remember correctly. Yes, and everybody knew that was a beautiful place and everybody wanted to go there. But our guest, Steve, did go there and was there and spent time there and was actively involved there. So I'm going to leave him to tell you all of that. But just give me a second to pop back to Koos so that he can tell us a little bit more about the Legacy Conversations Patreon support group and also the GMJ YouTube channel.
Hello everyone, just a short announcement, won't take much of your time. People have been asking me, how can you assist the channel? You know, we've been going on now almost 4 years. We've recorded almost 1,000 videos and we were fairly successful. We are close to 4 million views and we are very close to 1 million hours of being watched. So we've done a lot to boost the image of the SADF and the SAP. And we will carry on doing it for as long as possible. But we do need help. We do need you to support us in any way you can. Spread the word. Make good comments. Give it a thumbs up. And also, if you wish, join the Patreons. That's for $5 a month. Of course, if you want to make it $20 or $50, you're more than welcome. There's about 50 of you who's doing that right now, out of 100,000 a month who come here to look at the videos. And that really assists us because that, in the first place, makes us feel good. And secondly, it pays for our Zoom. And we can also use the money if we go on a field trip or if we need new equipment. That's the one way. The other way is you can support us by buying my books. The books I wrote, or the George M. James books, which are all very, very good books, and it's books which you would be interested in. If you like legacy, you're going to like those books. So we created a brand new channel on YouTube where we discuss only the books, and thus we're leaving the legacy channel alone just to do the military stuff and police stuff and your stories. I will leave the links for Patreon as well as the new YouTube channel. I'll leave it in for you in the description. Thank you. Let's get back to the video.
Right. Thank you for that. Back to our chat with Steve. Steve, very, very welcome here. Steve Crane is his name. 3SAI, as I said. I am going to shut my mouth now and all over to you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Fossey. Morning. Yeah, I was born in Scotland, 1962, adopted as a baby. My adoptive parents were, my mother was Scottish, my father was from London. He had joined the Royal Navy as a boy seaman at the age of 15 in 1946 and spent 15 years in the Royal Navy as a arms artificer, or as we in the SADF know it, a wapentifie. And but he worked on slightly larger guns than our infantry wapentiffies did. He met my mother in the Navy. She was in the RENS, the Women's Royal Naval Service, and that's where they met. And when he completed his service, he had suffered from asthma all his life and was advised to move to a warmer climate for his health. And apparently they considered both Australia and South Africa and chose South Africa. So I was almost an Aussie, but I managed to miss that. We came over on one of the mail ships in 1965. I turned 3 years old 2 days before we docked in Cape Town. So I've been here since 3 years old, and I'm now 63, so 60 years of my life is here. So really, I'm South African. At the age of 16, as we all did, we were given forms by our guidance teachers at school to fill in for national service registration. And on that form is a box that said, asked if you intended to become a South African citizen. And figuring that the country had given me my education and everything, I ticked that box. And as a result, I received call-ups, which other immigrants who hadn't ticked that box didn't receive. In the end, that was a good thing, because I was already doing camps when the Citizen Amendment Act of 1984 resulted in many immigrant males like myself being involuntarily naturalized to increase the pool for call-ups. Several of my colleagues ended up doing basics at the age of 25 or 26, which is not a fun thing, as we all know. I finished matric in 1979 and went to university to study, but for various reasons, too much party life, my father passing away, things got a bit out of control and I dropped out after a year and a half. I received 3 call-ups in total. My first one was for 1980 to 7 SAI with Burke's Luck, which later moved to Palabora, but got deferred for that one. Next one for 81 was for 8 SAI Uppington. Again, I got deferred for that one, which is nice because I've not heard good things about either of those places. I ended up going into the January 82 intake at 3 SAI in Potchefstroom, which was quite convenient for me as I lived in Randfontein at the time, so not too far away. At the time, the commanding officer of 3 SAI was a Commandant Henrico, and the RSM was a Warrant Officer 1 Uckerman, who was a big, scary figure to us with his giant moustache, but we never really saw that much of him. I don't know what happened with that intake. I think something went wrong with the planning, and they received far more people arriving than they had expected. The result being that we were dealt into companies from starting from Charlie, because Alpha and Bravo were the current Oman companies who were up on the border. And they would normally have had, I think, 3 companies or maybe 4 for basics, but we actually had like 5 or 6. It's Charlie, Delta, Echo, Foxtrot, Golf, and perhaps hotel companies as our initial dealt in. And that was obviously far more than they wanted to work with for basics. So they got Foxtrot, Golf, and maybe hotel, if it existed, companies together, formed us all up by 6s in a big squad and counted off from the right. And the count stopped at the guy right next to me. And that turned out to be very lucky, because those guys were sent off to 2 SAI at Walvis Bay, which is another not very nice place. So I was very lucky there and got to stay at 3 SAI. We were still too many people for the unit infrastructure. And Charlie and Delta companies were in the bungalow lines inside the 3 SAI base. Echo company was in tent lines inside the 3 SAI base, but I was in Foxtrot company, and we were actually in tent lines within the main military base, but outside of 3 SAI itself. Our leader group also were not from 3 SAI. They were brought from 5 SAI in Ladysmith, which was a July intake. So they obviously had available staff to come in and run a company. So everyone, all in leader group for our company, except for 2 corporals, PF corporals from 3 SAI, were from Ladysmith. Those corporals were Corporal Brown, who was our platoon 3 platoon sergeant, and Sergeant Corporal Joyce, who was platoon 2's platoon sergeant. And I was quite glad about that, because Sergeant Joyce was not a very nice man. He was really cruel and unnecessarily so to his troops. but less said about that, the better. Corporal Brown was hard, and at first we did not like him. We thought, no, this is not going to be fun. But it turned out that he was hard but fair, and we grew to respect him. And one very nice thing that we got from being with Corporal Brown was that he was absolutely anti-camo cream. Black is beautiful. So when we actually did anything where we had to camo, our platoon didn't use Black is Beautiful. We used something which, if I remember correctly, they called Jav. It was a sort of a greenish liquid in a bottle that was used for cleaning the old canvas web gear. And we actually used that to camo our faces, and it was not anywhere as difficult to get off your skin as the Black is Beautiful was. I don't know what had happened to Corporal Brown in his border service. I don't know if it was some damage to his hearing or if he had some kind of PTSD after some incident. But whenever we went to the shooting range, he would help us, prepare for shooting. But then when we actually started firing, he would move back from the firing line several hundred meters and wouldn't stay close. So I'm not sure what that was all about. But anyway, each platoon had a lieutenant, first or second. I think ours was the first lieutenant. I forget his name. And two corporals. One was the platoon sergeant, who in our case was Sergeant Corporal Brown. And then we had an instructor corporal who was responsible for theoretical instruction, while the platoon sergeant handled the more physical instruction, drilling, and so forth. I forget what the name of our other corporal was, but he was an Afrikaans guy, and that will come up a bit later as what happened because of that to me. Our kit was issued alphabetically to the companies, and because there were too many of us, we were the last and were not issued Stahldacker because they ran out, which was a good lucky thing for us. So we were the only company in the intake and perhaps ever in national service to do basics in only bush hats, which we didn't mind at all. We had no floors to polish because we were in tents, and there was a little bit less attention paid to dusted inspections, obviously because of the fact that we were in tent lines with dirt floors. We didn't even have ground sheets in our tents, just hard-packed earth. During basics, we had this guy join us. He was a slightly older guy. I don't know what his history was in civilian-wise, but he had many tattoos. And the rumor or the story that he told was that he had been in a previous intake at SAI. And for some reason, they had mutinied and all been discharged and then recalled up in another intake. Now, whether that is true or not, I don't know. I've never ever heard any other corroboration of that story. Anyway, that was the case. And then, as I said, our instructor corporal was Afrikaans, very Afrikaans. Spoke English to reason okay-ish, but his written English was not good at all. And because we had many, well, not many, but a fair number of immigrants in our, not actually, let me corroborate. We had one immigrant in our platoon. That was myself. But we had many English guys who couldn't speak Afrikaans or very well, had obviously not paid attention to Afrikaans lessons at school. And although I was the only immigrant in the platoon, I was also the most bilingual person in the platoon. It seems I've always had a flair for languages and actually earned some bilingualism certificates at school. So what happened was that the instructors were required to prepare their lessons, theoretical lessons in both English and Afrikaans, so that they were able to answer any questions from English speakers who maybe didn't understand something and wanted something explained. And because our corporal was not very good at Afrikaans, he enlisted me to be his translator. And that meant that I had a lot of extra duties doing translation for him, but it also let me skip out from many of the less pleasant activities that my platoon mates had to undergo in sort of after hours and so on. One interesting thing that happened when we were in basics was that the Dutch band Bolland released the song In the Army Now, which was rather appropriate at the time for us. At the end of basics, we started second phase and moved into, well, we were all lined up on the parade ground, the whole battalion, the whole intake, and they started calling off musterings and asking for people to move forward to those musterings. And the last ones left over would become footsloggers in the 2 infantry platoons. And as they went through all the musterings, clerks, chefs, mortars, storm pioneers, so on, I was wondering what I wanted to do. I didn't really have an idea. And then they came up with drivers, and I thought, well, driving a vehicle sounds better than walking around on my feet all for 2 years. So I chose to become a driver. We moved into we were in the 3SAI base in the old tent lines that Echo Company had been in for basics. There were 2 platoons of drivers. We did our light and medium license in Bedfords. We had an old fussbait Bedford built in 1947 that we learned on. And we were instructed and tested by an old sergeant major from the maintenance unit. And I don't know what age he was. He was probably sort of our age now, but to us, he seemed like ancient. We wondered how he was still in the army. But he was a rather cranky old soul, and he carried a swagger stick, which he was quite happy to beat us with as we drove if he wasn't happy with what we were doing. Anyway, I qualified for my light and medium license there. There were 2 platoons of drivers. Each was under a fresh national service second lieutenant and corporal, who couldn't keep control very well, so the discipline of many of the drivers was lacking. The result being that they brought Sergeant Steyn, possibly the most feared and hated NCO in 3SAI. He was brought off the section leaders course and put in charge of getting the drivers back into shape. It was rumored that he was sent down from the border from one of our Oman companies after a brass-hole bullet was placed on his pillow as a death threat. This is the type of guy he was. He was not well liked by the troops. And he gave us twice daily oppies for several weeks. So every morning from our tent lines to the vehicle park, which was about 800 meters, it would take us about 45 minutes to get there while we did oppies on the way, and the same on the way back in the afternoon. And sometimes, if he felt like it, somewhere during the day as well. And we were probably the fittest driver trainees in the army at any time, I think, because of that. After a few, probably about 5 or 6 weeks in that phase, they asked us, well, maybe less. They asked us for volunteers to become HQ drivers who would go to Pretoria for a further driver training. And at the time, the thought of going to the border didn't really appeal. So I thought, well, this is good. Let me volunteer for that. And also, we can get away from Sergeant Steyn. So myself and my buddies volunteered for that, only to find that Sergeant Steyn went to Pretoria with us. But he turned out, he was still a hard guy and put us through a lot, but he turned out not to be quite as bad as he was when we were at 3SAI. Anyway, we went to Pretoria, and we lived in the apartments in Tech Base in Snake Valley. If you've ever driven along the N1, you'll be familiar with those apartment buildings with different colors on each floor. That's where we stayed. And we worked in 4 Vehicle Reserve Park, or 4 VRP as it was known, which was a huge park with many, many vehicles which had come straight from the manufacturer and then gone into storage. And we spent some of our time servicing those vehicles before they were shipped out to units. In one case, we serviced a number of short wheelbase Land Rovers, or Garys as they were known by us, that had basically 20 Ks on the clock, but had been sitting there for 8 years. They hadn't moved. So we had to basically do a lubrication service on them, get them running, and then off they went. So we did some Land Rovers, and we did Sarmals as well. While we were there, we were given SAML series technical training by a civilian instructor from Truckmakers, the manufacturer of the SAML series. And we qualified for SAML series licenses, which allowed us to drive any SAML-based vehicle of the 20, 50, or 100 variety. And we were tested on that by the same cranky Sergeant Major who came from Potch that we'd had our other tests with. That was quite fun because he got us all in a SAML 100, which is a rather long vehicle. And we were all in the back, and he'd have one guy in the cab driving, and he took us right into the city center of Pretoria. And he expected us to start from first gear. We weren't allowed to pull off from second gear, which was possible in those vehicles. But we had to pull off from first gear, and he expected us to get up to sixth gear in the city while not exceeding 60 kilometers an hour, which is not an easy thing to do. Anyway, after much beating with his stick, and one guy nearly drove over a tunny in a Volksie, and we ended up all except one, I think, got our SAML licenses. One guy was considered too useless to be allowed to drive, so he never got the license. While we were there, we also did training with buffels, and we did an obstacle course training in, I don't know if you're familiar with the Pretoria area. There's a bowl beneath the Voortrekker Monument, and there was a vehicle obstacle park in that bowl, and we spent many hours doing obstacle training in both buffels and SAML 20s and 50s on those obstacles. We also did a lot of running from that bowl back to our base, to our bungalows. In the afternoons, often Sergeant Stein would say, well, we're not going to drive back today. Well, I'm going to drive back, but I'll see you guys back then. You guys run back. So we still kept up our fitness that way. We didn't really receive any kind of, we were going to be HQ drivers, so we didn't receive any kind of operational military driving training as such, other than the obstacles and so on. But we suspect that the other drivers in the remainder 3SI probably did receive such training for what they would be experiencing up on the border. Anyway, when we finished at 4VRP, we went back to Potch with our SAML and buffel licenses, and learned there were, I think, 24 of us, and one guy didn't pass, so they wanted only 18 HQ drivers. So they asked for 5 or 6 volunteers to go to the border. And by that time, I'd learned enough about the army to know that staying in a training base with all the sideshows and discipline for 2 years would not be a very fun thing. So myself and my buddies decided we would volunteer to go to the border. And we were transferred into O Company, ondersteunings or support company, and joined them where they were on bushface training in a tent camp outside Potch. And I don't recall us receiving any actual driver training during that time. I think we spent time doing guard duty and other random things until they decided that, or someone in the leaders group decided that they were going to do a new mobile mortar platoon experiment, which involved a buffel with a trailer, a short two-wheel trailer, with 281mm mortars, and this mortar section in the back of the vehicle. And the idea being that we could drive around and deploy the mortars wherever they were needed. Because there was limited space in the vehicle and just enough space for the mortar crew, they decided that the drivers needed basic mortar training as well, so that we could step in if there were any casualties and be able to help man the weapons. So we received a bit of mortar training, and I remember carrying base plates around, which is not such a lacquer thing as well. And the most memorable thing of that period was one day when some of the extra loads, or ladings as they were called, the charges, if you're not sure if you guys are familiar with mortars, but basically these charges are sort of rings that get placed onto the tail of the mortar bomb. and as it is fired, they burn and provide an extra charge. And what sometimes happens is that they don't fully burn. And this one day, partially burned charges fell off a bomb and started a felt fire. So I remember the whole company spending an entire day fighting felt fires. And that was the most memorable thing about that period. We did that for maybe 2 weeks, and then they decided they didn't like the mortar experiment, so they cancelled that. So that never actually came to fruition. While we were there, there was an incident of food poisoning. We woke up one night to the sounds of screaming, guys in agony, and not everyone was affected. And as it turned out, none of the drivers were. And we spent the rest of the night ferrying these sick guys to the sick bay in Potch with all the available vehicles. And it was concluded that there had been 2 pots of meat stew prepared for the evening meal, and that one of them had been contaminated with some kind of bacteria that causes food poisoning. And of course, that didn't stop them from telling us that we were stiff and disgusting and it was all our own faults, and getting oppied back and forth because of that. Anyway, that was that. Then that phase came to an end, and it was time to deploy to the border. And we were to go to 5-3 Battalion in Ndangwa, the support company. And I remember being given a lecture by our Commandant Enrico, who told us that statistically, given the size of the company, 3 of us would be killed during our time on the border, which is a sort of sobering thought. But at the end, only 2 of our company ended up being killed. We flew from Waterkloof, drove there, went there in buses, the Alvera tours buses that you still see around today. They did all the transporting for the army. So luckily we weren't going into the back of Samuel, so buses were a bit more comfortable. One of the buses had an accident on the way. If you're coming off the N1, just by the Voortrekker Monument, you come down the hill to a T-junction, and I don't know if the driver fell asleep or what happened, but this bus came flying past our bus and went straight across the T-junction and down the into the bush and down the slope on the other side. Fortunately, no one was seriously injured, and we all got to Waterkloof safely and flew up to Grootfontein. And we always talk about flossies, and an interesting fact is that most of us were never trooped in C-130 Hercules aircraft. The ones that we flew in were actually the civilian L-100 versions operated by SAI. So those are the flossies that we flew to the border in. And an interesting thing about those, they've got, for those who haven't been in one, it's not like a passenger aircraft with a nice linings and so on. It's all bare metal and piping and so on. And when you descend, it rains inside the aircraft from condensation. So that was quite an interesting experience. Right. So first deployment, we flew up to Grootfontein, spent one night in the little transit camp there, and then we got onto the Wit Olifante or White Elephants Mercedes trucks with the big high-sided articulated trailers. And we drove up through Ovambo Gate, as it was known, just south of Oshivelo, and then we went to the Oshivelo where the training camp was for sort of introductory training to the border area. Whenever any unit went up there, they first stayed there at Oshivelo for a couple of days for some training. I don't recall us getting any kind of driving training while we were there. We didn't do much at all, but we were only there for a day or two before they took all the drivers off and sent us off into the bush somewhere and set us to work digging trenches in what we were told was a recreation of the trench complex from the smoke shell attack. We're not sure what the purpose was of digging those trenches, but we were only there for 6 or 7 days, and then we went off to Ndangwa to 5-2 Battalion, where because we were a support company, we were always deployed as into the battalion HQ base. So we were based at Ndangwa, and we had a staff sergeant in charge from 3SAI, in charge of the transport park and in charge of us. I forget his name, but he was also a guy we didn't like so much because he was a bit of a arsehole, pardon the language. Anyway, he had to look at how we would be dealt in and how we would be utilized. And most of us were going to be normal biffle drivers for operational use, convoying, picking up troops, patrolling, that sort of thing. But they needed 2 people for base maintenance task, one to be the sucker man and one to be the trash man. And as luck would have it, he decided that I was going to be sucker man. So what sucker man was I had a biffle with a 4-wheel trailer with probably a 4,000-liter tank on the back with a pump and a Lister diesel engine and a hose, and I spent my days sucking out the 2 septic tanks at 3SAI, driving through the town to where there was a big pan for dumping waste, and then pulling the lever at the back to have the stuff all come flooding out. And sometimes it flooded on you because if you weren't quick enough to get out the way. But I spent 5 or 6 weeks doing that, fighting with that Lister diesel engine, which was not in the best of condition, and it was quite a challenge to keep it running. But I did for most of the time. And then after a while, we actually got a Ford truck, which looked like a flat-nosed, more modern Bedford, but it was a Ford that had actually the honeysucker device on the back of the truck. So we had that for a while. After about 6 weeks, I'd become really tired of this and wanted to actually do some more operational driving. So I managed to persuade our staff sergeant to rotate us a bit, and I got on to normal biffle driving tasks. First operational drive that I remember was a short patrol in the Ndangwa area. I remember being yelled at to stay in the tracks, because that was something that for landmine consciousness, you drove in the tracks of the vehicle in front to try and minimize the chance of hitting a landmine. And not having had any kind of operational driving training, that was not something that we'd learned before. So the troops on the back were very upset that I wasn't doing that, but I quickly learned to do it. And then the second operational drive I did outside the base was a convoy. We convoyed a bunch of empty biffles up the road past Echo and Alpha Towers to the Santa Clara border post south of Angola, and into Angola to go and uplift a company. I was the very last vehicle in the convoy. And at one point, I saw through the dust that the convoy had stopped not far in front of me. So I slammed on the brakes, only to have the pedal go all the way to the floor because the brakes had failed. So I swung out and just touched the last of the biffle's rear light cluster and managed to not cause any serious damage. And even though I had no brakes, I still had to continue with the trip. So that was quite interesting, because as we got through Santa Clara, we had to weave through the destroyed buildings and mine holes, landmine craters and bombshell craters. So because I didn't have brakes, I ended up lagging a bit behind the rest of the vehicles. And as we got out onto the straight on the other side, I had to put on speed to try and catch up to them. And just at the right periphery of my vision, I saw the last biffle disappearing into the bush along a track. And it wasn't far ahead of me, and I was going rather fast and didn't have brakes, so I had to try and slow down with engine braking as much as I could, and took this corner at what was considerably faster than the biffle really should corner at. But luckily the vehicle didn't tip over, and I was able to catch up with them. We drove into the bush for a while, and where we met this company of infantry guys that we picked up, and we're then heading back. And we were driving along a tweespoorpaadjie, as we called them in Afrikaans. There's no really equivalent English word, but it's basically a vehicle track of just the 2-wheel tracks. But we try never to drive on them because of the landmine possibility. So we were driving alongside it and zigzagging across it where necessary. We got to one point where there was some anthills, and we had to cross over this track and sort of navigate around an anthill. And that was the perfect place for a landmine. And I was the third vehicle, and because the first 6 of us managed to stay in the same front guy's tracks, the 7th guy went slightly out of the tracks and he hit a landmine. And it just so happened that he was the guy that had been the trash man who'd driven the trash vehicle in the base. And this was his first time out of the base, and he was rather shocked by this. And when he got back, he said, no, he wants to go back to trashman duties. He doesn't want to be an operational driver anymore. So anyway, luckily nobody was hurt in that landmine incident, which was actually quite surprising, because the corporal who was in the vehicle was actually standing up, leaning over the cab, saying something to the driver at the time that we hit the mine, and he was just white from all the smoke and looked like he had a bad sunburn, but luckily no one was seriously injured. Then I got off buffel driving. At 5-2 Battalion, there were 2 Quairfall horse boxes based there. Now, the Quairfall horse box is based on a Magirus Deutz truck, not even a Samel, the very early Magirus Deutz truck. It is basically a Samel 100 Quairfall, but with a large armored and, well, not armored, but landmine protected back carrier that could take up to 10 horses. According to Steve Camp's book Surviving the Ride, there were 6 manufactured from 1981. And as far as I'm aware, at that time, 1 had been destroyed by a landmine. There was 1 at Bereda, or the Equestrian Center in Potchefstroom. And there was 1 at 1 Swaspes unit in Otavi, and then the 2 at 5-3 Battalion in Rangwa. Myself and one of the other guys, Stephen Behrens, became the drivers for these things. And they were earlier vehicles that didn't have synchromesh gearboxes as the later Samels did. It was the first time I had to learn to double clutch when changing gears. But we soon became practiced enough to upshift without using the clutch at all. And in some cases, you could even downshift without using the clutch in higher gears. The taskings that we did with those horse boxes were, some that I remember was, we took both horse boxes and picked up troops and horses from Ugongo. And there were buffels with us as well, that the Bereda troops went in the buffels, and we convoyed them up into Angola to Mongua, past Onjiva on the way to Thangongo, and dropped them off there, where they were going to do horse patrols down south back towards Ugongo, where their base was. And we were to pick them up somewhere along the cut line in a few days' time when they got there. So we drove back to another base in 5-2 Battalion. I forget what its name is now. Was it Ombalantu, where the big baobab tree was? I think it was that. And they wouldn't allow us into the base. So we actually parked our 2 vehicles outside by the chopper pad, and we camped there for several days while we waited now to when we could go and pick up these Bereda guys. And because we were considered to be not on ops, we were not issued with rat packs. We were issued with wet rats. And those consisted of cans of bully beef, canned potatoes, and canned green beans, which is not the most appetizing of food to last us for a few days. Anyway, we stayed there for a few days, and then when we were to go and pick these up, but they had an incident in Angola. Something had spooked their horses while they were camped somewhere, and more than half the horses had bolted back for base. And Major Jackson, we called Happy Jack, at 5-2 was with Drew I see there, the Bereda was kind of his pet, and he was not happy with this. And the result was that he ordered that these guys were not to be picked up. They had to walk out with the few horses they had, and they had to carry their saddles. If the guys who'd lost their horses had to carry the saddles themselves. And so they walked back, and we never picked them up. We went back to 5-2. And another tasking, we were tasked to collect horses from Okatopi and take them down to Swaspes at Otavi, where the Bereda had the Bereda element was operated from Swaspes. Swansbest was a unit with trackers, Bereda, and some other sort of specialized troops in those natures. Bike troops, I think they had a bike squad troop there as well. Anyway, when we got there, we discovered that their own horse box was unserviceable, and there was a sick horse that had to be collected. So we were tasked to take one of the horse boxes from Atavi, and we drove to Apuvo in Kaokaland to go and pick this horse up and turn it to an Atavi. And then we returned to Ondangwa. On the way back, just north of Ovambo Gate, we got a rear wheel puncture and had to change the wheel, which proved really interesting. The toolkit for that vehicle was supposed to have a 12-ton hydraulic jack. But of course, being the army, we never had the right stuff. And we had I think it was a 5 or a 7-ton jack that was normally issued to a buffel. Now we had to figure out how are we going to lift this huge vehicle with a jack that is not up to the task. And in the tradition of Burma Kaplan, we made a plan, and the tar road was raised in the area, and we actually pulled the vehicle off onto the sloped side of the tar road with the flat wheel on the high side, and used the assistance of gravity and the leaning of the vehicle to help us jack it up so that we could actually change the wheel. And we managed to do this all the time, being terrified that this huge vehicle was going to fall over on its side, which would leave us in endless trouble. Luckily, that never happened, and we were able to continue on our way back to Ondangwa. Those are the only times I remember us being operationally deployed with the horse boxes, but they did provide us with some other benefits. We had every Saturday morning, all the troops in the base that were not actually busy with some task were required to do maintenance tasks around the base, what we call tuin ops, i.e. garden ops, TUIN. But we called them tuin ops because the Afrikaans word for counterinsurgency is teeninsurgensie, which is TEIN, whereas garden is TUIN. So we jokingly called it tuin ops, and that's what people had to do. And the commandant in charge, OC of 5-3 was very worried about the serviceability of those horse boxes, because they could be tasked at a moment's notice to go and do something, and he wanted them to always be available. So what we figured out we could do was, during the time that they did tuin ops, we said, no, we have to do maintenance on the horse boxes, and we would lift the bonnet of one of them and unbolt the top cover off the engine and sit up there fiddling around and just chatting while the other guys were doing scoffling and so on in the garden. So that was quite fun. One funny incident happened with one of the horse boxes. In the vehicle park where the horse boxes parked, there was buffels, and the 2 horse boxes had their spaces. And there was also a shed built from poles with galvanized sheeting around it that housed a bunch of motorcycles that the bike squad guys used. And buffels have a hand throttle. So they don't, when this hand throttle is completely closed, they don't idle. So to have the vehicle idle, you open the throttle to a certain point. And a lot of vehicles didn't have handbrakes, a lot of the buffels. And what you would do was leave it parked in gear. And when the hand throttle was closed, the vehicle couldn't start. And so that was not a problem. And what happened one day was, one of the buffel drivers had parked his buffel in one of the horse boxes spots, in my colleague's horse boxes spot. And we'd warned them not to do so in the past. And my colleague got annoyed with this and decided he was just going to push this buffel out of the way, because the horse box was more than capable of pushing a buffel along. And as luck would have it, the driver of this buffel had left it in gear, had no handbrake, and had left the hand throttle open in the idle position. and the vehicle biffle started and chugged off and crashed into the bike shed and caused some damage there. So that wasn't a fun story from those times. And that was the end of our first deployment to Ondangwa. We went back down to 3SAI and went on pass. And when we got back, we deployed again, and this time we were going to 5-2 Battalion at Ugongo. When we got to Oshivelo, this time we actually did do some driving training, and a number of us from 3SAI company and a couple from our C or D company, I forget which one, who were there at the same time, as well as some drivers from 7SAI, were given Casper training on a police Casper Mark 1 by a sergeant major from Oshakati. And we spent, I think, 2 days doing that and got licensed to drive Caspers. The Army didn't have Caspers at that time, but this was to become relevant a bit later. When we got to Ondangwa, the drivers were allocated to 2 tents. We had a small square 16 by 16 one and a larger 16 by 32 one. And while there was no animosity between our English and Afrikaans guys in the drivers, our close friendships were language-based. So us 5 English guys took the small tent and the Afrikaans guys took the larger one. We spent a few weeks there doing various tasks like minesweeping with the assault pioneers towards the Shakatis in the morning because the road was still untarred from that at that time, from a bit outside of Ugongo to a bit outside of Shakati. It was later tarred all the way. So you had tar all the way from Ovamba Gate right up to Ruakana. But at that time, it was still dirt. So we used to have to sweep that in that direction. And in the other direction towards Ruakana, the road was tarred. So there we could do just a mine check, basically, where we drove faster along the road and just kept an eye out for any disturbance in the tar where they might have been planting mines. And then we did troop and supply runs to and from Oshakati and the various 5-2 Battalion platoon bases. It was one of these troop runs back from Okalongo where one of our drivers was killed after hitting a mine. There was the way to Okalongo by road was quite a bit of a long one, and there was a shorter route along a Shona. So we used to drive along that Shona, but it was kind of known that Shona was basically a minefield because they used to plant a lot of mines there. And as luck would have it, one of our drivers hit one of these. None of the guys in the back were injured because they were all strapped in. But our driver had some trouble with his biffle throttle and had rigged up a wire contraption to get his throttle working. And this had stuck in some way. And he, instead of stopping to fix this throttle, he actually stood up while he was driving, leant out of the cab to adjust this wire contraption. And it was at that time that they hit the doubled mine on the rear wheels, which flipped the biffle forward and landed upside down, killing him. That was one of the 2 guys that in our company that was killed. The other one was one of the mortar guys from one of the mortar platoons who was also killed in a landmine incident somewhere else. Yeah, then in that deployment, we ended up going, those of us who'd got Casper licenses were sent to Oshakati, where we met up with that sergeant major that had trained us on the Caspers and the other Casper drivers from 7SAI, and 2 campers from a maintenance unit joined us, and we flew to Pretoria under command of that sergeant major. And at 4VRP, we signed out the SADF's first 12 or 14, I forget which, Casper Mark IIs, and a Sama 100 diesel Bowser that the 2 maintenance guys drove. And we spent 4 days convoying these Caspers back to Grootfontein and signed them over there before returning to Ugongo. We encountered a problem on that convoy because when we reached our first night stopover at Klerksdorp and went to refuel the vehicles, we discovered that they'd been issued with the wrong fuel hose. It had the wrong coupling and couldn't be connected to the pump on the fuel Bowser. So one of our guys managed to get a piece of garden hose from some civvies, and for the rest of those 4 days we had to fill all the vehicles by siphoning diesel, which was not such a fun exercise. Once we got back to Ugongo, myself and my buddy, one of my buddies were detached to Romeo Mike which was a reaction force unit operated by then 201 Battalion, later 31 Battalion. And we went, I think it was more than the two of us. There was the two of us from support company, and then a couple of our our 3-star drivers from our infantry companies as well, and some from drivers from 7-SAI and perhaps some from 8-SAI. Went to Congo, where the 201 Battalion Ops base was. We were placed under the control of a Corporal Jan Okamp from 3-SAI who'd gone with us, and he was given the temporary rank of sergeant so that he had parity with the Romeo Mike team's platoon sergeants. Actually flew from Inana to Congo, C-160 at treetop height, which was quite a rough flight. I remember that. At Congo, the base was split into two. The mess and ablution blocks were in the middle, and on the front side nearest the base was the vehicle park and the tents where the detached drivers lived, and behind and the other side of the base were the things like the stores and the lines of the actual 201 Battalion forces. And we were not permitted to go into that side of the base unless we had some specific tasking, like fetching something from the stores. First patrol I did from there was in local area around Congo, with a team of a platoon of the Vasakela Bushmen, the smaller, more yellow Bushmen. And we left at night, and we expected to use night vision equipment, which we'd never even seen before, let alone been trained with. And so these things were goggles that you wore on your face, and I wore glasses, so it was very difficult for me to wear these goggles in the first place over my glasses and still be able to see. And secondly, because they jutted out from your face several inches, when you turned your head to look out the side vehicle or the buffle, you typically were hitting your head against the windows. And I was not coping very well with driving with these things on. And the corporal in the back stripped his mud and yanked me out of the cab and jumped in the cab and drove himself. So that was my first experience of driving with Romeo Mike. And I didn't, because of that, I think the Vasakelas didn't think much of me, so I never really clicked with them. Luckily, they did changed out their rotations. They used to rotate 6 weeks in the ops base and 6 weeks back in Amiga. And the next rotation was Delta Company, which was a Baragwena company. They are the larger, more African-looking Bushmen, and I clicked much better with those guys. Our platoon leader was a Second Lieutenant Douglas Randall, and I was his driver, and the platoon sergeant was Don Ervia, and my buddy Graham was his driver. Each platoon operated as a Romeo Mike team with 4 vehicles, 3 buffles, and 1 logistic vehicle. And at first we had a muffle, which was basically a buffle without a troop compartment that had a flat load bed on the back instead of a troop compartment. But these were not well suited to the bush, because they had an exposed 100-liter fuel tank that was, first of all, was easily damaged while bunde bashing, and secondly, needed more frequent refueling than the buffles because they had 200-liter tanks. So after the first patrol, we decided to not use the muffle anymore, and we created what we call the log buffle by unbolting and removing the seats from the back of a buffle to create a very deep load bed. And that was what we used for the rest of the time that I was there. During that time, we did a fairly major operation where 2 platoons were combined under the command of First Lieutenant Brian Dupree, who was later passed away, I believe. He chose me to be his driver, and Lieutenant Randall moved to another vehicle in the team. We spent about 6 weeks in Angola, operating in the area north of 5-2 Battalion, just east of the Kunani River, south of Zangongo. On the way there from Congo, we had just turned off the dirt road onto the tar road north to Ondangwa, when I was the lead vehicle, and we stopped about 50 meters up the road to wait for the rest of the convoy to catch up, because there were quite a lot of vehicles. And almost immediately we stopped, we saw what appeared to be an RPG rocket streak past. So this was at night. This happened at night. It appeared to be an RPG rocket streak past in front of us. Whether it was aimed at us or not, I still don't know. And there was an explosion that set a telephone pole ablaze. Lieutenant Dupree ordered just my vehicle to move slowly forward while some of the troops on the back fired off 40mm grenades from their Snortniuses. We received no return fire and don't think we hit anyone. So before long, we continued on our journey. We later learned that on that night, 16 telephone poles along the tar road had been blown up. I had my 21st birthday while we were in Angola. It was on a Thursday. And as it happened, Lieutenant Dupree's birthday was on the Saturday. So he decided we should have a rest afternoon, and both platoons came together along a shore somewhere. A small patrol was sent out to find a cow. When they came, these bushmen came back with a small herd, and the lieutenant picked one of them. The bushman slaughtered it, and we had a braai in the bush. Someone managed to tune into a Currie Cup rugby match on one of the TR-48 radios, and the guys who like rugby, and I'm not one of them, unfortunately, they enjoyed listening to the match. And while we had this braai, I remember receiving two 21st birthday gifts from fellow drivers. One was a warm can of Castle that some guy had been carrying along in his kit, and the other was a packet of Chesterfield cigarettes. A funny thing that happened while we were on that operation was that we came across a mission station somewhere south of Zangongo along the Kunene River. If I remember correctly, it was sort of up on a bit of a bluff. And when we got to this mission station, there was no priest there. There was just this black guy who was sort of caretaker or lay preacher or whatever of this place. And he told us that, no, there used to be a Portuguese priest there, but obviously he left in the time back, when in 75, when things fell, and they were still trying to keep this mission station going. And they had a Land Rover there which didn't run, and this guy didn't know how to drive. But he asked us if we could help to get this Land Rover working again. And we looked at it, and it turned out to be nothing too complicated, so we got it working again. But then Lieutenant Dupree had decided for some reason that he was going to claim this Land Rover as a spoil of war. And when we drove off, he went with the Buffles and this white Land Rover with Lieutenant Dupree driving it on his own. Now, landmines, and that was not a good idea to be driving a Land Rover around there, but yeah, that's what he did. Almost immediately we left, this African guy took off on foot to Zangongo, to our base there, and it took him 2 days to get there, and then he lodged a complaint about the theft of this Land Rover from the emission station. And when we made comms with Amiga, Lieutenant Dupree was ordered to return this Land Rover immediately to where we got it from. So we stayed where we were while he and one or two bushmen went back with one Buffle and went and took this Land Rover back, and then rejoined us. When we got back to Congo at the end of our deployment was looming, and we had to rejoin our company. And it was so late before they had to leave that we actually managed to get onto the Dakota run back from Nkongo to Ndangwa. Our company was already there in the transit camp, and we spent just one night there before flying out by Flossie back to 3SAI to go and pass. And that was the end of our second deployment. Our third and final border deployment, we went to 5-4 Battalion in Inana. And that was not a lacquer place. The commandant in charge of that place was a different character, and he ran it more like a training base in the States than an operational base on the border. It was full of sideshows and discipline, and you were not allowed to walk anywhere. You had to either be marching or running anywhere in the base. I don't recall doing any driver tasks there, but thankfully I was soon detached again back to 201 Battalion. And I mentioned earlier flying from Inanna to Nkonga. I think I got my chronology a bit wrong because I'm sure that was this time when we were left from Inanna, we went to Nkonga. And we couldn't have been there very long when four of us, myself and Graham Geldart, my buddy, went to two other guys who I don't think they were with us at Nkonga, but they joined. They had guys who'd done the Casper course with us as well. So we all went back to Grootfontein and we met up there and we signed for 4 Caspers and were given orders to take them through to 201 Battalion at Amiga, where Commandant Brian Adams was the OC at the time. We overnighted at Rundu and the following day continued through to Amiga. And somewhere along the way, we discovered 2 new Lance Corporal medics who were trying to get to Amiga, so we gave them a ride. At Amiga, we lived in what was known as Kimbos, little wooden huts. And the 4 of us shared a Kimbo. So there's 2 English guys and 2 Afrikaners. And we shared a room, but we were never really on friendly terms with them. And one of them, his name I'll always remember, it's called Jan Abraham Christoffel Nel. Now, if that name sounds familiar, you'll know why. He was nicknamed Gatu, which was from some TV show which I don't recall watching. But he was not a very nice guy and would threaten violence over the littlest thing. He was later to become a serial killer. He murdered a teenage girl and raped another who managed to escape at a disco at the Postmansburg Showgrounds in 1984. Was imprisoned for 12 years and after his release went on to murder another young woman and attempt to murder another who escaped, leading to his rearrest. So it just goes to show you, you don't know who you'll be with in the army. So we stayed at Amiga for our last few months, driving for the companies as they did conversion training on operating with Caspers instead of Buffles. But I understand from other legacy conversation interviews that 201 Battalion continued using Buffles operationally while 101 Battalion used the Caspers. So they obviously didn't like the experience of using the Caspers. And some of my experience of the Caspers was that the Buffle was better for bundu bashing than the Casper. In the Caprivi, there's a lot of very, very thick sand, and I would find that the Caspers would struggle a bit through that with the thick sand. And also being larger vehicles, it was difficult to maneuver through tight bush. While we were there, we also drove in contact drill, ambush, and attack demos for the frequent VIP visitors to Amiga. And I recall once one of them was Magnus Milan, then Minister of Defense. He visited, but didn't actually speak to me. While we were there, the new crop of leader group from infantry school arrived, and as you've heard on other legacy conversations, they immediately get sent off to a bush camp for some indoctrination training. And we did some driving out there with those guys doing that. It was there that the driver's side windscreen of my Casper was starred by a bullet. There may have been alcohol involved, as a sergeant, one of the instructor sergeants, decided that he wanted to test if the windows were really bulletproof and fired a 9mm round at it. Of course, it didn't penetrate, but it left a nice star on the windscreen. And they did a bit of a huddle, and we were instructed that if anyone questioned us about this, we were to say that it was caused by a ricochet during training, but I don't think anyone did ever ask about it. When it became time for us to clear out at the end of our 2 years, we organized a ride to the transit camp in Grootfontein to rejoin our company before flying back to Three-Side to clear out just before Christmas. And that was the only time we ever flew into or out of Potch. All our other times we were bused to and from Waterkloof, but for some reason that time we came into and landed at the Air Force Base at Potchefstroom. A couple of miscellaneous memories from time on the border. There was a saying, absence makes the Avambos blonder. And it was rumored that one of the guys who was with us on that Casper course and drove for Romeo Mike, he was from SAI, and we used to call him Noordside because he had a bit of a wall eye, and his one eye used to look out a bit to the side. I'm not sure how he managed to be a driver, but anyway. It was rumored that he was later caught with in flagrante delicto with one of these with a young Avambo lady, and there was some drama over that. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. This is something we heard. And then you may remember in those days the Scope magazine. We all read that, and there was a section in it where young ladies could pick up pen pals with the troopies, and I made a couple of pen pals there that I used to correspond to. Never really kept up contact with them afterwards. And that was the end of my 2 years. And then for Citizen Force service, I lived in Randfontein, and as luck would have it, I was dealt into Regiment President Kruger, known as RPK, which was based in Randfontein. It was an infantry battalion there. My first camp was, we clawed out the end of 1983, and already September 84 was already in camp, in my first camp. We did a 30-day guard camp at the ammo dump at Jan Kempdorp, which was only memorable for two things. There was an outbreak of pubic lice that afflicted about half the guys, and luckily I was not one of them. And then there was a guy in our bungalow. He was a Greek guy who was learning to play the bouzouki, which he'd brought with him. And unfortunately, he'd only learned to play one tune. And we very quickly became tired of this one tune, which he would play over and over and over again on this bouzouki. I'm surprised the bouzouki survived the camp. My second camp was in 85. It was a 30-day guard camp at RPK itself, where 4 of us were called up and only 3 of us arrived. The corporal who was supposed to be in charge didn't arrive, and so they were sitting now with 3 riflemen, and they didn't know what to do. So they obviously looked at our records and decided that I was the most likely candidate, and they promoted me to Lance Corporal and put me in charge of these other 2 guys. So that camp, we basically just guarded. I had to supervise these other 2 guys who stood guard at night. There were 2 guys there from some kind of regiment they were called pioneers. These guys were guys who were not very well mentally gifted, and they were in this unit. They were not really soldiers. They were in the military, but not quite soldiers. And they used to go do guard during the day. So our guys just had to do guard at night. And during the day, I had to assist the 2 civilian ladies who worked in the unit office. My next 2 camps were 60-day border camps in the internal South African borders. For some reason, although we were based in Randfontein on the Witwatersrand, we were neither part of Witwatersrand Command or even Northwest Command at Potchefstroom. We were actually part of Far North Command, who were, I think, based in Pietersburg, was their headquarters. So our camps were all done up in the Northern Transvaal. The first camp I did there was in 1986. Near Messina, we were at a company base at Waipi. You may recall in 1985, there were a number of landmine attacks on farmers. That was in that area. So we were there the year afterwards, and there was still a lot of fear and nervousness about that. And all the farms were very much in sort of secured camps with electric fencing and floodlights and everything around them. We were based there and spent most of the time just doing normal patrolling along the border and so on. Myself and one of the other drivers actually spent some time outside the base, where we set up a small camp outside one of the farms. There was a big tree, and there was actually some cold water piped in there, and it was sort of a cold shower that you could use. And we spent time outside that farm, being on guard at night there, and doing our patrols from there. what we used to do for patrolling was we were driving along the little dirt road along the border fence and look for tracks crossing across, and those tracks could be either planned insurgents infiltrating or just refugees. And I recall one day we found these tracks early morning, and it was a bit reminiscent of my time with Romeo Mike doing follow-ups on Spoor. We tracked this guy for most of the day before we eventually caught him. And to this day, I don't know whether he was a refugee or an insurgent, but we had to take him through to the HQ at Messina, which was the standing order if anyone was caught. So we took him through there. We had to hang around for some reason, and it was eventually about 9 o'clock at night before we got to leave to go back. And a funny incident happened on the way. We turned off the tar road and we were heading on this little dirt road, farm road down towards the border road to get back to the farm where we were based. And guys in the back were sleeping. It was winter and they were huddled in sleeping bags and sleeping in the back of the biffle. And I was driving, and on this road there was some big bird that flew up when its vehicle came, and it missed the cab and hit the flat face of the troop compartment just next to the cab, flipped over and landed in the back on top of these guys, who all woke up screaming with a hell of a fright with this large dead bird landing on them. So that was quite funny. Yeah, that was basically that camp. And then my next camp was another 60-day camp in 1987 or 88, I forget which. And there we went to Ellis-Russ, which was more on the Botswana border. I can't remember if our whole battalion were based at Ellis-Russ or just a company, and the other company was somewhere else. Anyway, we weren't at Ellis-Russ very long before two of us drivers were detached off to a place called Swartwater, which was a platoon base. And so we took two buffels and we spent the rest of our camp there with that platoon. I think we did there was just patrolling and driving to farms, visiting farmers, discussing things. There was a hotel called the Bosveld Hotel along the nearby, and the couple that ran it were very friendly towards us, and we spent many hours sitting in the bar there, talking to them and drinking beer. And it was strictly against standing orders, but yeah, well, troopies will do what troopies do, and we did it anyway. One interesting thing I remember from that was that there was a particular farm that we used to visit. The farmer was a very Afrikaans guy. He was actually a member of the AWB, the Afrikaner Weerstandsbeweging. And he, for some reason, took a liking to me, the Engelsman. He liked this Engelsman for some reason. And such that he actually gave me a gift of the walking stick that he used to use. It was a sort of hand carved, kind of like a knob kerry, but with a very small knob on top. Now I still have that souvenir to this day. One of the funny things about that farm was, for some reason, we were in the house, in their house at some time, and we walked past his teenage daughter's room, who she was away at boarding school, but the bedroom door was open. And we looked in, and she had posters on the wall, but not of pop singers like your average teenage girl. But she had a poster of Eugene Blanche on her wall, which I found really strange. But anyway, so that was that camp. By that time, I was married and had children, and I got tired of these 60-day camps away from home. So I requested to transfer to our regiment HQ, which was granted, and we used to go in every Wednesday evening for a few hours to do admin evenings, and then we did a couple of short camps every year to handle the admin of the clearing out in and out for the unit deployments on the longer camps. In that time, I had to get a corps transfer from infantry to personnel services corps in order to attend a course, and I was promoted to corporal. And then at the end of one camp in, I don't know which year exactly, but we were told that the requirement for the 6 cycle, because citizen force was done in 6 2-year cycles, where you had to do 90 days trip within each cycle. And we were told at the end of this camp that the requirement for the 6th cycle had been dropped. And those of us who were in second year of 5th cycle, which I was, had now completed our service. And the adjutant was very offhand. He didn't sort of thank us for our service or anything. He just basically said, "Get the hell out of my base. I don't want to see you again." So off we went, and that was the end of my army service, except for in late 93 or early 94, I received a call up for one day, where we went back to RPK, and we were told that they needed volunteers to serve, to provide security over the 94 elections. And as you can imagine, because of the offhanded way we were dismissed, most of us declined to volunteer for this service. So that was the end of my military service. And that's my story.
Well, Steve, I found that entertaining, but I also a few things that I would like to comment on. Firstly, is it looks like you grabbed every single chance uh, in a positive way. You went through military service enjoying wherever you could enjoy and just putting up with the negatives. Am I right in saying that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I was never one of the very negative guys who didn't enjoy the experience. Yeah, I mean, a lot of it was not enjoyable, and we had to do things that we didn't want to do, but on the whole, I look back on it with some fondness and good memories.
I shared a wee little tale here of my love for Congo, where you were based. Um, I hated the place. I was forced to live there for a whole solid week on one bush tour. We had one other operational there, uh, operating. It was a trooper. So they had shoved me in a tent on my own. And as I said to Steve, what I do recall is that the first time I went to the ablution block, I tried to make that the very last time I went to the ablution block. But also something that has struck me, and I know the pilot's name. I've reached out to the pilot, and I still would like to chat with him. My very first incident as a Alouette flight engineer happened with my very first bush tour, flying a trooper to Congo. We were going to whatever we were tasked to go and do, and we actually witnessed a landmine, a buffalo hitting a landmine, and my first real action was landing there and casevacking two guys with minor injuries back to Congo. So that was my first time ever at that base. And I promise you, you mentioned Inanna. We had a SAF city at Inanna, so we lived very, very well at Inanna. And all the other bases, Ruakana, yes, also SAF city there. So these are all memories that chatting with guys, and I must add here that this was a totally unscheduled chat with me. Steve and myself only got acquainted uh, at Irish time, 9 o'clock this morning for the first time, 8 o'clock this morning for the first time. But it brings back so many memories, and I relive so much uh, by chatting with you guys. So, Steve, you want to tell us a little bit about your after you left, what happened? Because I do believe you live in the Strand in Cape Town.
I do, yes.
I, I do
I,
believe you love photography.
I do. I must admit I've slacked off a bit in the last few years. I don't take many pictures now. My wife has got a lot of chronic health conditions, and I spend a lot of time caring for her. And as such, I've become very homebound and lazy. I don't go out much except to go shopping and so on. So, yeah, I don't take as many pictures as I used to, but I used to enjoy it quite a lot. Um, yeah, professionally, I'm a software developer. When I dropped out of university back in 83, I looked for a job in the computer field. I'd never really considered computers before. Back in the 70s, it was not a thing in South Africa. We didn't know about computers really. When I was when I was going into Standard 8 was the very first year that the Transvaal Education Department offered computer science course training. And they had very strict requirements. You were required to have A's in both maths and science, which I didn't have. So I was considered too stupid to do computer training. But the joke is on them because I've managed to fool the world over all these years because I've been working as a computer programmer. But yeah, so it was only at university where I just was introduced to computer programming, and I became interested in that. So I tried to find work doing that, and I had, of course, the knowledge of my call up for January 82, and so to find employment in sort of late 81 was quite difficult, but I was employed by the then SA Perm Building Society, which later became part of Nedbank, as a computer operator, operating their mainframe computers. So I did that for about 3 months and then went off and did my 2 years of service. Came back to the Perm and continued as an operator for some couple of years. And then in 1985, I was eventually, they got tired of me nagging that I wanted to be a programmer. So they sent me on a programming course, and I became a programmer and worked for them for quite a few years more, and eventually left and worked for companies doing vehicle tracking software. And I was there for 25 years, and when the COVID hit, hard times happened and they retrenched 30% of the staff. And because I was one of the more senior in terms of duration and was highly paid, I was not considered a good candidate to keep. So I was one of the ones who went, and got a very good retrenchment package, and spent about 8-9 months at home just looking after my wife and messing around while I gradually chipped away at that package. And then I realized that that package is now looking a bit thin, so I started looking for another job, and I was very lucky. I only had 3 or 4 interviews with different companies before I got interviewed by the company that I'm with now. They're known as Genesis Technologies, and we develop software for the insurance industry. So that's where I'm working at the moment. And I'm quite lucky that we work in a hybrid manner where Mondays and Fridays are in the office days, and the other days I'll work from home. But because of my wife's health, they actually permit me to work from home full time. So I work from home. So I have a terrible commute of about 15 meters from the bedroom to my study.
I'm going to say to our audience, put your questions down below. I really enjoyed this. As I said, I really enjoyed the mental images that were flashing through my mind, and I'm sure others will do exactly the same. I've asked Steve if he can scratch out a few photos. He may, which we'll include. He can throw in a few of his favorite real photography photos. He's got I'll put the link downstairs. He has a Flickr page where you can go and view his photos. I'm going to include the link downstairs, as I say. But this is fun. So please, people, come and talk to us. Come and share your experiences like Steve has. It's just so lovely to step away with a positive smile on my face after a chat like this. The one thing that I'm going to ask you, did any of the experience, just let's say experience, stand you in good stead in civil life of your military years? Did anything positive that you can say about that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think so. The things you learn as a soldier, like the ability to sleep anywhere at the moment's notice, that's something I'm still able to do. But just having a certain amount of self-discipline and being able to motivate yourself is not something that we typically, as a low-level troopie in an infantry unit, are experienced, because we've always got officers and corporals telling us what to do, and we don't often have to think for ourselves. But the fact that I ended up operating with Romeo Mike and driving Caspers and horse boxes and things, where I was very much on my own and under my own. I was just given a very broad directive of what I was supposed to do, and I was responsible for doing it. I think that taught me things that perhaps the ordinary troopie doesn't learn.
Internet, I'm going to say thank you very much for you spending your time with us. I'm going to say to Steve once again, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. Sorry that I waffled on about some of the memories that came back to me, but that's the beauty of this. This is a conversation to share. So much of what happened up there in the operational area is forgotten or is lied about. So it's always great to hear these positive recollections of what happened up there. Once again, Internet, this was a pleasure. Do leave your questions below, leave your comments below, and if there's enough questions on a day and Steve's in a mood to come and answer some of those questions, I'm sure he won't mind coming back to come and have a chat with us. So, as we always say here at Legacy Conversations, until we meet again, God bless.
Thanks. Cheers.
Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and ring the bell to receive notifications.
Edited by Fossey. If you'd like to see what he gets up to in his spare time, do please visit his own little YouTube channel, Fossey at Treasure and Treats. Links included below. Your support would be highly appreciated. Help me grow my little channel. Thank you. Dankie. Inkos kakulu. Bye.